Hello everyone, I'm Trish Lynch from IOHR in London. Thank you for being with us for another episode of our Human Rights TV. The heavy-handed tactics used by the Israeli Defense Forces against Palestinian activists has recently gained international attention when Ahed Tamimi, the 17-year-old Palestinian activist, was sentenced to 8 months in prison after a video of her slapping and kicking 2 Israeli soldiers outside her home in Nabi Saleh went viral on the internet. We know that at least 31 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli snipers since Gaza residents began the Great March of Return, protesting the right to return to their ancestral home in what is today's Israel. With us today, we have Mr. Chris Rose, the director of the Amos Trust, an NGO that partners with networks of community projects to raise awareness and provide support to those addressing the root causes of injustice and poverty. Mr. Rose, it's good to have you with us today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. Now, despite many attempts by the international community to resolve this conflict, in 2018, the death toll unfortunately continues to rise. Now, we know that 31 Palestinians at least have been killed and at least 1,400 have been injured by the Israeli security forces. Tell me what your take is on these outrageous figures.
I think when you go to the border, or so-called border between Gaza and Israel, what you find is a 30-foot high concrete wall with automatic gun turrets, which anybody within 500 metres of the wall are immediately sighted by those. And so when we talk about people coming and protesting and throwing stones, they're throwing stones against a prison wall in every respect. It's 30-foot high concrete wall. It's not throwing them against people, it's not throwing them against some barbed wire or something like that. It's a situation where they're coming and they're saying, we have to come and protest here. We're not allowed out. They're not allowed into Egypt at the moment. The borders there have been closed routinely. There's an exclusion zone around the sea as well, so not allowed out more than a few miles from the coast. Fisher boats will often be shot at as well. So people are coming and they're saying, actually, we have to raise awareness of our situation. Okay. And we have to do that in a non-violent manner. For me, the parallels to the situation with Martin Luther King's death 50 years ago, when you see the protests which were part of the civil rights movement, there are so many similarities to the situation here, where people are saying we have to go and march, we have to do this, even though we know the consequence will be that we will be shot and injured, because what other choice do we have? Mm-hmm.
It's a big choice to make, isn't it, really?
It is. I mean, if you're living in Gaza, there's 1.9 million people in Gaza. Over 70% are dependent on food aid. Yeah. The power cuts are between 12 and 18 hours a day. 90% of the water can't be drunk. The unemployment rates for young people particularly, I think, are over 60% now. So when you're in that situation, there is so little hope in one respect, and yet we go in regularly and we visit our partners there and we find actually there is tremendous resilience and hope in the people there, and yet also they're saying this cannot carry on. And yet the simple reality is, and what happens in Gaza all the time, is that when there's some confrontation it goes up in the news and then as soon as it ends it just drops off. And for most of the world they'll just let it carry on. And unless there's events like the last 2 weeks, Gaza just falls out of a news cycle and it carries on, and the people there have been trapped for 10 years now with limited supplies coming in. So it's essential that we encourage the sort of non-violent protests we've seen, and these people do this knowing full well that it will be awful. Yet without this, how can we change a narrative? How can the world actually take any notice of what's going on there? Because the narrative says this is terrorists, these people are doing this, and actually it's just not the case. The vast majority of people in Gaza do not support those actions in any way, and yet we just want to live peacefully and have an open borders.
UN Secretary General Guterres has called for an independent and transparent investigation into the killings of the 31 Palestinian protesters, including a journalist who was shot and killed while wearing a flak jacket with the word press written on it. Now, Israel has denied the request, stating that it's just defending its sovereignty and its borders. Tell me what the international community should be doing to hold those accountable for the killings.
Oh, it's very simple. What the international community can do is what they choose to do. The international community can make Israel accountable. The easiest ways of doing that is by restricting trade on certain things, certainly weaponry and things like that. It's also to restrict payments on certain things and particularly on trade. We support the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which seeks to use non-violent means to change the situation on the ground. Because if the government will not take any notice of courts, will not take any notice, will refuse to investigate these sorts of things, then what other choices do you have? We don't want to be punitive. What we want to do is to get justice.
It's estimated that about 350 children are currently behind bars, and Amnesty International have estimated that every year hundreds of children are tried in military courts. Why are so many young people being imprisoned in Israel?
There's several different ways of looking at it. We would argue that very often the waves of resistance come through from the young people, particularly in the refugee camps. Okay. One of the most effective ways of breaking that down is by arresting children at a young age. Children who'll be throwing stones maybe because they're bored, they've got soldiers coming into the camp, and they've got so few amenities in most of the camps. Or else they'll just be doing nothing. But if you pick up children at a young age, particularly teenagers, you arrest them, then actually other members of that community no longer trust those children very often, because they're going to be seen as a collaborator, going to be seen in different ways. And so often they're arrested to break down the resistance at that age, at a young age, so that young people will not resist. Now, often that backfires as well, obviously. But the measures taken against children are awful, particularly as those ones who are arrested and tried. Many other people are just detained, so you can be detained for months without trial. And still, children is absolutely awful. We know children in places like Hebron where they go to sleep fully dressed, because they don't want the soldiers, when they come in, to find them in pyjamas and drag them out of the house. And these are children. I think it was last week.
They're anticipating being dragged out of the house in the middle of the night, aren't they?
Yeah, because the soldiers, that's what the soldiers are there for. They're a military occupying force. And the soldiers' role in Hebron is to enforce the occupation. That's what their role is, to protect the settlers there and to enforce the occupation and to let the people know they're occupied. So for children, it's that. I think it was a child last week who was detained, I think he was age 3, something like that. He was a toddler, where they started to detain him for throwing stones. Oh. I mean, how far can a 3-year-old throw a stone, for goodness sake? His father was there and prevented it. But it shows the absolute lunacy of what's going on. And when you have a military machine which is dominating people's lives.
It's impossible to talk about Palestinian activists' children without mentioning the 17-year-old Ahed Tamimi, who has become the poster child of the resistance, really, hasn't she? She's been called the Joan of Arc of Palestine. She's just been given an 8-month sentence for attacking 2 soldiers. She smacked them, she punched them, she tried to kick them. 8 months seems incredibly tough for someone 17. Why do you think somebody so young has become a symbol of Palestine resistance?
I mean, she took those actions when she just had the news about, I think it was her brother or cousin had just been injured.
Shot in the face with a rubber bullet, I think,
So it was a reaction to that. Her whole life has been the situation of real conflict with Israeli soldiers. For her, to be honest, if she hadn't had the media coverage, she probably wouldn't have been tried by now. So she should have just been held, awaiting a trial. And the trial and sentencing, in many respects, the sentencing is less than lots of people expected. And so within that, the coverage and the awareness has actually meant that it's a slightly lesser sentence than many expected. The reason it's covered is because it was picked up by the press, it was filmed, and people could see the lunacy of this situation. That you've got a young girl who's hitting some soldiers who are fully armed there, and the official line is that she was attacking them. I mean, it's absolute madness. And it just shows you how it is, what happens on a daily basis.
Her father has been in and out of prison many times too, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, and a huge number of the adults in Palestine have, particularly adult men in Palestine, have been arrested, or they've been detained. Many of them will not have been tried, many have been tried. So you have this as just, it's almost a part of the life. And it's part of what it means to be living under an occupation.
In direct contrast to the violence that we see from some of the Israeli and Palestinian communities, what you do in the Amos Trust is to teach resistance, but in a creative, non-threatening, non-violent way. Absolutely. Tell me how you go about that and how successful it is.
So we work with partner organisations on the West Bank and in Gaza. I'll talk about the 3 on the West Bank. Holy Land Trust is one of our partners there. They are set up to teach non-violent resistance and non-linear leadership, which basically means you don't just do what you've done in the past, you think of new ways of resisting, think of new ways of leading things, because they recognise that without that there's no way forward. They encourage civil society within Palestine and also within Israel. So they work with Israeli non-violent peace activists saying, you must develop this within Israel while we develop this within Palestine, so that both work hand in hand. Our second partners, Ahed, they use the arts. They use dance and music to do what they call beautiful resistance. Now that's in Ahed refugee camp. Ahed is surrounded on two sides by the separation wall and a military base there. It was recently reported as being the place in the world with the highest incidence of tear gassing. And it's pretty much a daily occurrence. Soldiers will come in and let go tear gas in the camp. And they teach beautiful resistance, which is using the arts to bring hope and so that children will not be arrested. They won't be involved in stone throwing.
Gives them something to do, somewhere to go.
Yeah, and to be something really deeply proud of, to see a way forward, to be hope, and to be involved in expressing something which you wouldn't do otherwise. And our third partners are located next to the separation wall, deliberately located there. They're a reconciliation society within Palestinian society to try to address the tension which people feel there and the breakdowns which occur because of the occupation. So those are some of the examples of developing responses which are non-violent. For us, what we also try to do is to develop those ourselves and to mirror what goes on there so that we are doing activities which would be hard for them to do on their own. So for us, what that means is we're involved in home rebuilds, so houses which have been destroyed by the Israeli army. We come and rebuild those in Area C on the West Bank. We're involved in a festival every year. We're involved in the Bethlehem Marathon. We've got a forthcoming protest bike ride coming up in a few weeks' time along the West Bank in protest against the Giro d'Italia going to Israel. So a whole variety of creative responses to get people involved so that when they come back they'll tell their story as well and they'll raise awareness of the situation there and of the incredible people they've met.
Your work revolves around engaging directly with the Palestinian people, working at a grassroots level without much interaction with international organisations or the government. Do you believe that working at this level, hand in hand with the people, is enough to bring these two communities together?
I think that you start off from where you are. I think there's no evidence to suggest governments have done anything particularly proactive about Palestine. The peace process has been going on now for, it depends, you could say 50 years. It's been going on for years and years and years. And where's it got to? A deteriorating situation all the time. The only hope is at a grassroots level, we would say. We believe it's only the grassroots level, when you have civil society groups pushing for change, it will happen. Politicians, we would argue, follow eventually. At the moment, the gap seems to be getting wider and wider. So it's essential to be investing in those civil society groups who are looking to change the situation.
Your organisation runs a number of community support projects in the occupied territories, such as your sponsorship of the local hospital in Gaza and your work with the NECC to provide support and vocational training for young people in Gaza. Tell me how these programmes work and why they're so invaluable to these young people.
So in Gaza we work on two particular projects. Within the Al-Ali Hospital, we work on some of their community programmes and we particularly focus on breast cancer screening. The rates of all forms of cancer have gone up in Gaza over the last few years and they're not sure why. It's very hard to get research teams in to work out why that's happened. We focus on breast cancer screening because if you're a woman and you're diagnosed with breast cancer, your survival rates are 4 times worse than they are in the UK. So that means your life expectancy is far lower. Not only that, but there's no radiotherapy at all allowed in Gaza. Radioisotopes which they use for radiotherapy are not allowed in. They're a restricted substance which is not allowed in. If you want a chemotherapy course, the likelihood is you will not finish that course as well.
Why is that?
Because they're restricted drugs, which so many drugs are at 0 stock rates in Gaza.
Oh, so there's not enough to continue the entire course?
Yeah, so that's very often the case as well. So what happens is that women are desperately scared of treatment because if you get permission to go for treatment, for radiotherapy, you'll have to go to the West Bank or to Jordan normally for that treatment. You'll go on your own, you'll have to stay there throughout the treatment, and you may not get that treatment, particularly if you've been involved, your family have been involved in politics. You probably won't be allowed out at all. So as that side, it's very expensive when incomes are very low in Gaza as well. And it's a traditional society where breast cancer isn't talked about.
Yeah.
So what we see in Gaza has been actually that now it's a double evacuation, so complete mastectomy is the only course of treatment available now for most people. And so for us, what we want to do is to say, actually, we have to raise awareness of the human cost of this on women
Absolutely.
who, at the worst time in their life, have this as the situation because of the occupation, because of the blockade. And the breast cancer screening program basically works with women to raise awareness of how they can screen themselves, detect any lumps. And then it takes them into hospital and has mammography units there to do scans to see if there's anything there and to work out a treatment regime for them at the earliest possible times. It's run by volunteers in the communities, and there's men and women's groups there now to really raise awareness so it's not a taboo issue. But for us, it's the classic case in point. We have people who run marathons for it and a whole load of other events as an act of solidarity to say this is wrong and this should not be allowed to continue. Nobody should be treated in this way, particularly when there's hugely advanced cancer treatment units just a few miles away. So that's what we do.
And it is just a few miles away, is it?
Oh yeah, just a few miles away. So within Israel there's units which would have all the latest equipment, highly developed, which these women can't access at all. So we do that. Then the other treatment programs we work with is with NECC is about supporting young people who don't see any opportunity for employment really. So it's giving opportunity for employment and employment skills, but also psychosocial support so they don't get trapped in cycles of anger and bitterness about this, but are actually able to see more positive outcomes, have the skills for that, and to basically have the resilience to keep going as well. So it's a whole load of training schemes which we support in there, together with other partners. We're not the major funders by any stretch of the imagination. And then also particularly psychosocial support, which we're really focusing on, especially for that.
UN representatives have called the question of Palestine one of the most intractable conflict situations in the history of the United Nations. And many people believe that it's so entrenched, that the problem is so big and so complex that really there is no solution. What would you say to people of this mindset?
I think the resolution is very simple. I think the resolution is very simple. If you give people full equal rights, they will work out how they're going to move forward. The resolution is simple. It's whether there's political will to get there. And so far there hasn't been the political will to get there. So from our side, we'd say there are very simple resolutions which can happen. We wouldn't care if it's a one-state, two-state, five-state solution. It doesn't affect us. It's the people must have the right to choose the future they want.
The Amos Trust is clearly doing an amazing job at grassroots level, interacting with people at all levels. Where can people go to find out more about your organisation and perhaps help?
Please visit the website, www.amostrust.org, Facebook pages, all those things. We want people to get involved. There's loads of film, other media on there. We're a small organisation. We're deliberately small. We want to be small and creative. We don't want to be large. We want people to be involved. We take loads of people over to Palestine to visit, to see the situation for themselves, to visit our other partners, our street children's projects and elsewhere, so that people can get involved and to work out how they want to respond as well.
Chris Rose from the Amos Trust, thank you for sharing with us the invaluable work that you and your team are doing on the ground.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us for another episode of IOHR TV, putting human rights into focus. Don't forget you can see many other episodes on our website, and you can also keep up to date on our social media feeds. Join us again next time. For myself, Trish Lynch, goodbye.